Hello, beautiful soul. Welcome to the Elevate Your Soul podcast. Today, I interview Professor Jamie Lynn, educator, clinician, and author who's had over 20 years' experience in the medical industry. Jamie shares her story on how vaccines have affected her family. After having two of her kids vaccine injured, both under the age of 3, she has worked in the mental health field and has owned and operated mental health clinics and schools across the United States. I asked Jamie what harmful ingredients are still being used in vaccines today, what symptoms and side effects these ingredients in vaccines cause, short-term and long-term, misconceptions around vaccines and anti-vaxxers, and the outer pressure parents get for not wanting to vaccinate their kids and how to deal with that. You can follow Jamie on Instagram at Professor Jamie Lynn and check out her 2 websites at hopeincacademy.org or hopeforautism.com. I hope you guys enjoy this podcast episode. Hello, Jamie. Welcome to the Elevate Your Soul podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me. Appreciate you.
Thank you. Can you tell us a little bit about who you are?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Professor Jamie Lynn, and for 20 years I've been a clinician and an educator here in California. I've owned and operated mental health clinics and schools, mostly for traumatic brain injury and the developmentally disabled.
Wow, that's awesome. Can you tell us your story in relation to vaccines and how they have affected your family?
Yeah, sure. So the personal journey that led me into being aware of vaccines when I was in graduate school, my 2 children were vaccine injured. My daughter was about 2.5 at the time, and my son was 1.5. And so, of course, when you're in graduate school and, America, the medical associations, we're heavily indoctrinated that vaccines are safe, they're studied. This is what you do. There's a fear element to it, but there's also a safety and security. And so I was in graduate school and I took them in for their routine vaccine shots, and my daughter had anaphylactic shock. And so she stopped breathing, and then she broke out in hives and really severe eczema.
Wow.
And then my son at the time developed 105 fever and seizures. And so she, from the mental health perspective, wasn't impacted. She just ended up with gastrointestinal issues and a lot of eczema and autoimmunity,
Right.
Issues with, as a female, OBGYN issues.
Yeah.
Because now I've learned so much, which I'm sure we'll get to, but my son then just dissipated. He was healthy, walking, talking, playing, little boy, to completely brain injured was the only way I knew how to describe it, because he stopped doing all of those things and was very, very sick and lethargic. His muscular system and the seizures started, and then it got very confusing because then they wanted to say it was autism. And I was young. I was a young mom. I was only 23 when I was finishing graduate school, so I had to figure it all out. And now here I am 20 years later.
Wow, that's crazy. Can I ask what vaccine shot both of the kids received when they had those reactions?
Yeah, so that's the challenging part, is they get about 6, at that age. And if you're catching up, you'll take your baby in even when they're sick, which the American Pediatric Association and the Center for Disease Control tells you to never vaccinate when you're sick, but they do it all the time, because you'll go in, a lot of parents running behind, and then they'll say, oh, let's catch you up. So when we ended up going into what we have in the US is the National Vaccine Injury Fund Court, when you're injured by vaccines, you can go into a court. And then we got the medical records, and I realized that they had 6 because they were being caught up. I was that case. I had brought them in. They were both having colds and were sick, and they were like, oh, you're behind on the 12 months, and here we are at 18 months. Let's just catch them all up.
Wow. So you were able to go to court for this?
Yeah, they have what's called a National Vaccine Injury Fund. And so you file in what's called VAERS, which is the Vaccine Adverse Reporting System. So the doctor's supposed to report to VAERS. A parent can do it too, but back then I had no clue what I was doing. And Harvard just did a study recently that showed only 1% of doctors and parents actually report vaccine injury. And that's where our conversation will take us today, is trying to figure it out when you're doing your due diligence. Is you don't really know instantly. And if you do, you just write it off like this is the new normal, that children are getting sick all the time with ear infections and diarrhea and eczema and asthma. So they have the course, and we ended up being part of a class action for Dominic, my son, who's now 19, which was called the Autism Proceedings. And they're pretty famous. They've been in newspapers all the time, and with Bobby Kennedy and Aaron Siri, who are like our lawyers that are leading the way on trying to get mainstream media and moms especially to find out like, holy, what is going on, So Dominic was part of those omnibus proceedings.
So what sort of symptoms can parents be aware of who are still vaccinating their children? What are some things to look out for that aren't necessarily normal or aren't necessarily healthy or good for the body after they receive a shot?
That's a great question. I mean, obviously ear infections are huge to pay attention to, because those just seem so minor to have ear infections that you're, constantly bringing your child back to the pediatrician. Like they have an ear infection, they have a fever. It just seems similar to a common cold, or the obvious like gastrointestinal issues, constipation, and diarrhea. Because now what we're learning about how these vaccinations work with supposed to be stimulating the immune system, but it's actually attacking the immune systems to where the gastrointestinal system becomes impacted, as well as the ear, through these particular channels in your brainstem that are connecting your gut to your brain. Most people are familiar now with like the gut-brain connection, and doctors talking about how much our gut is its own brain and has all the serotonin and neurotransmitters equivalent to what's actually going up in here. So those are, I think, the most common things, but that's the challenge, right? Is you just think that's normal.
Right, I see. Or they just caught a common cold, or they're just going through something because they're young, right? And they're vulnerable. Interesting. So the two kids who were vaccine injured, are those your two oldest kids?
Yes. And then my two younger ones, who are 15 and 16, are not vaccinated at all.
Not vaccinated at all. Okay. And you live in California. Were they able to go to school? Like, was it challenging to get them into school without being vaccinated?
Yeah, so it was and it wasn't. And so we're talking about, in the past, in the 2000s and the 2000 up until 2018, when, we're watching this, we're living in an extremely rare paradigm shift of the medical industry trying to control families in their homes and what they do with their children and how they go into school. But even before that time, so if we're just talking about, the year 2000, let's say 5 to 2017, before the political debates and wars started, when media and parents started to kind of rise up. When you go to school, not just in California, anywhere in the US, the school districts will tell you have to vaccinate your children. Like they can't come, we need the shots, but you have something called personal belief exemption and a medical exemption. And so up until, there are more than one state, California, don't quote me, I think there's 6 states now that have passed legislation that removed the personal belief. So you have personal belief, religious belief, because people don't realize that there's aborted fetal tissue in vaccines. And so they purposefully allowed religious beliefs for Christians. There's gelatin, and so kosher if you're Jewish. There's pork, so there's animal DNA. So if you're Muslim, depending on your spiritual belief system. So they have the personal, which is just, I personally don't want to inject viruses, toxins, and bacteria, and I've done my research and no thank you. There's religious beliefs, and then there's medical exemptions, which says, according to what the Center for Disease Control, indicates, and their researchers, and we'll get into that, they're really a vaccine company. They've got patents and make billions of dollars off of this stuff. So that's the way that here in the US it operates, is those 3 particular information that the school nurse will give you when you're moving into a school district or your children are becoming of age and want your child to go to school. So they'll tell you that,
Right.
But if you're a parent that knows and has studied and was like, wait, what are all these parents that are like screaming from the rooftops? Hey, we
Yeah.
have an epidemic, 54% of children are sick these days. Like, where is it coming from and why?
Right.
They still get lied to by the schools and are told you have to.
Yeah. So your two youngest children, how are their health? How are their immune
So
systems?
they're extremely healthy. They have no
Yeah.
issues whatsoever. Yeah, they're
Did
just
you feel
healthy.
Yeah. Did you feel a lot of pressure as a parent from other parents in your community to vaccinate your other kids?
Yeah, but I don't, give a crap.
Yeah.
Like, I'm like a warrior mom. It's like,
Yeah.
don't ever, tread on me or my children. So,
Yeah. So
yeah.
how do you argue with the fact when people tell you that people who are anti-vax or not vaccinated, that they're putting other people's lives at risk? Is that true?
I think that's like the funniest one that we get because it's like, if your vaccines work, what are you afraid of?
Yes,
Like,
exactly.
it's just the dumbest. To me, that's like one of the most dumbest questions ever. It's like, wait,
Yeah,
your vaccines work, so what do you care about if mine aren't?
exactly. Exactly. And I've heard that as well. And then someone else recently um, came up with the argument that some people can't get vaccines because of their health or because of, other issues or diseases that they may have that won't allow that, then they are not able to get the vaccine. So those people are at risk already because, they're already ill with something else. And then because of that, they can't get this vaccine. And then the people who are healthy, who don't want to get the vaccine, are putting those people at risk.
Right, which is actually, they're using our own argument, which is,
Right.
vaccines aren't safe. And so we don't want our children to be vaccinated because they're not safe. And now medical research has become really amazing for those of us that are aware and cognizant, because genetic testing and all of the argument that they use that I can't get the vaccine because I have a predisposition that makes it dangerous. We're like, well, so do we. And by the way, the research has just showed it's almost 75% of people really shouldn't, between MTHFR genes and all of the different autoimmune illnesses that are lying dormant, because we all hold viruses
Yes.
in our bodies. And yeah, so they're just telling us the same argument. We're like, okay, yeah, that's why we're saying don't vaccinate.
Exactly, exactly. And what sort of things I've also had the heard in argument or conversation that for people who are pro-vax are saying that vaccinations these days are safe because the ingredients they used to use back in the day were harmful, but now they're not legal anymore. So now vaccines are safe. What kind of ingredients do you know of that they're still using in vaccines today that are harmful?
Yeah, that's the problem is, that's a longer story, but let me just answer your question. So there's
Yes.
formaldehyde, there is the debate that you're talking about the ingredient they said they removed was thimerosal, and that was removed because there was a big study that came out, and you had at that time like Jim Carrey and Jenny McCarthy and Robert De Niro and all these big movie stars saying it's the mercury,
Okay.
green our vaccines. And so they removed the thimerosal, but the medical community twisted their story around to their own narrative and ignored the fact that it had aluminum. So if people have heard of J.B. Hanley, and he does Children's Health Defense with Bobby Kennedy, and he wrote How to End the Autism Epidemic. They looked at the research on aluminum. So there's aluminum, there's arsenic, there's cadmium, there's formaldehyde, there's what was the one that everybody's making fun of Trump? Uh, the cleaner, like there's detergent cleaner in it.
Okay, bleach.
No, like detergent.
Okay.
It's escaping me, but yeah, you can go to the Center for Disease Control that says it's all safe and there's no harmful ingredients in it. And you can look at the ingredients, and you're like, oh my gosh. And then
Wow.
how they're cultivated and what they have to be cultivated on, to if it's a live virus versus a synthetic virus. And then
Right.
you've got, GMOs and genetically modified
Yeah.
issues. And then of course, fetal cell tissue lining and animal lining from
Wow.
whether it's a monkey or it's a chicken embryo. So there's peanuts in it. So
In
it's
the
like all these,
vaccines?
yes, there's gluten.
I've heard that, like, yeah, people who are really gluten intolerant or have really strong allergies, especially the peanut allergy, is actually commonly stemmed from children getting vaccines at a young age.
Yeah, and those are just common things when I try to have conversations with people. I've had to learn, and that's more of like the spiritual realm, like how to calm and like be in my zen, because I
Yeah.
used to be super hostile and like, and people just don't want to have conversations with angry people anymore. So that's something I've had to master myself as a clinician over the years and change my way of living. So a lot of times it's just having those simple, like, have you ever thought why we have a peanut allergy epidemic on our hands? Like, peanut
Yeah.
allergies never existed, and all these EpiPens, or like the eczema and
Yeah.
seizures, or like and all these heart disease, cancer. Like, hey, what do you think about cancer? Like, all of this like epidemic of cancer, just getting them to think themselves like,
Yeah.
okay, well, if it's not the thing vaccine that everybody gets, and now you dive into, it's never been studied, it's never been single blind placebo tested, it also has zero liability. Like, what company do you buy from that you have no liability? You don't have to test your product, and then they say it's the holy grail of medicine and gonna save your life. It's just like,
Yeah.
can you just answer me that? Like, we can do this
Yeah.
friendly.
Yeah, exactly. And when you gave your vaccine shots to your first two kids, did they give you, is there any warning sign like, oh, by the way, we're putting these chemicals into the body and it may cause autism or it may cause fever and all these things? Did they warn you about that before so you knew about it in your case?
I'm so happy you asked that question, because no, and that goes back to medicine. And when you look at the legal infrastructure of how medicine works,
Yeah.
informed consent, right? You, no matter what procedure you do, you're supposed to be signing that you have informed consent. You've been told the risk and the benefit ratio, the greater, for the greater good. You're supposed to be given when you go to the pharmacy. You can open the thing and it's like super huge in this package, and you have to do all these signatures. They have to see your ID if it's a controlled substance, and none of that happens with vaccines. And that just goes back to because they don't have any liability or ramification for injury or death that it causes.
Wow. Wow. That's crazy. That's crazy. I wonder if that's the same in New Zealand, and probably is. I remember like back in school where they used to give out vaccines, and I'd be like that one odd kid where my parents are like, no, we don't want her getting the vaccine. And I was like, why not? Like all the other kids are doing it.
That's crazy. You know what's funny? I just remember Dr. Murray Clark was the first doctor that treated my son, and he's a New Zealand citizen. He shares citizenship
Oh,
between there
cool.
and here. And
Cool.
so he was the one that first taught me to, like, to try and heal the gut and help Dominic, and not him, but my kids in general. Our whole family was to get, grass fed, organic
Yeah.
beef from New Zealand at Whole Foods. And so it's so great that you're from there.
Yeah. Oh, that's so beautiful. That's so beautiful. What other misconceptions do people have around vaccines?
I mean, we talked about so much. I think a lot of it is that anti-vaxxer that you talked about.
Yeah.
The truth is, the data is 90% of us are actually ex-vaxxers. We're actually, I think, part of a discriminated class of mostly women,
Hmm.
because it's the moms, it's not the dads that are doing their research. And really, that's the sad part when you get into the family unit breakdown and fathers not being very participatory in the upbringing of their children. And so, that's the first thing, is the misconception that we're anti-vaxxers and we're these like disease mongering moms that just don't
Yeah.
care about anybody else. And
Hmm.
we're dumb and we're uneducated and we don't do our research, and we're just these anarchists that hate the government, and we don't shave our armpits, and like that whole thing.
Yeah.
So I think that's A. And then B is, again, this, now you get the crazy mother label.
Yeah.
Now there's something mentally wrong with you. And
Mm.
so we've seen a huge trend, and a lot of people know my story. Those of us that are in the field and very vocal and professional, so myself having data, and Judy Mikovits having data, or Andy Wakefield having data, and Brad Street, who was murdered, and Dr. Goldberg, and Dr. Kartsanel, and Dr. Mensa, and Dr. Buttar. Like, you can literally, Erin, is a good friend of mine, the nurse that was just on Fox. You can literally take all of us, and any of us that have medical licenses, especially the women, we're labeled, like I was labeled bipolar schizophrenic was one of my
Oh my
accusations, that
God.
I was like mentally ill and couldn't cope.
Yeah.
And then you get ramifications. Judy was jailed. I was criminally charged. Dr. Bradstreet, we know, was like
Wow.
murdered. Same thing with Andy.
What
So
did they criminally charge you for? What did they label that as?
I was charged with criminal threats against law enforcement.
Wow.
Because I did scream. I was like, off my rocker, and it was
Yeah.
part of a whole long story. That could be a whole other podcast on mental health and like spiritual awakening,
Yeah.
sobriety issues. But yeah, that, and I did, I said, if you hurt my children, I'm going to kill you.
Yeah. Wow.
I did. Like, sorry, I'm a mom. You were hurting
Well,
my
they wouldn't care
children.
less if they killed your child from a vaccine, right? It's like, oh, sorry.
Yeah.
It's one of the side effects.
So that was part of those criminal accusations. And I did have a jury trial, and I was found not guilty by jury trial. And that was a beautiful story that I actually haven't really done any vocal interviews on. My lawyers were waiting to get through the counter lawsuits and figure out like the story behind that in my next book. And because it's very, I've spent 20 years in this industry, and I'm a rare professional in that I was on, not only was I a parent, because even some of these professionals like Dr. Patar is a dad of a son with autism, but then you have like Judy Mikovits, who doesn't have children. And then on top of that, I was on all sides of the fence, where I owned a school. So I was collecting the data and the corruption against the school districts here in the United States for the abuse and the violations to the American Disability Act and federal racketeering under color of law. I was going up against insurance companies. I sued insurance giants, and everybody thought like I was nuts, because it was like nobody's ever taken on insurance giants, and we settled those lawsuits out. I took on the government Department of Managed Healthcare in the state, and then I was like, another thing against me was married to an LAPD officer who was in trouble at LAPD, and then I started suing LAPD, and it was like this whole cluster of like, holy cow. But for me, it was really, there's no other way to describe it other than spiritual, because this was like this was my gift during this life that was granted to me, that Dominic was going to be the spirit in his body and suffer this, so we can do and change the world the way it needs to be changed.
That's amazing. Yeah, that's beautiful. You had a huge awakening, and that's what it was. That was your way of being an activist and actually making a change in the world. You're like, this isn't going to just impact me. I'm going to make sure other people don't suffer the same way I did. So good on you. And you had a lot of people in court cases you had to fight against. That's incredible. And
it's fun. It's fun. You just have to look at it as fun, like you just learn to laugh. I mean, I'm always equating, I've worked with law enforcement and fire departments and, high profile lawyers and military. I grew up in a military family. My dad was Army. My mom was Air Force. So it was embedded in me to just fight. Like, we're a soldier, we always talk about foreign and domestic, and then my kids, you go after my kids, it's like game on. So you just do what you have to do and make the best of it and keep going. But it's hard too, because I think with COVID and what's happening now, it's a double-edged sword, is because they're pushing so hard now on this vaccine and this indoctrination of, like you said, just give me the vaccine so I can go back to work. And like, can we all just go back to normal? And we don't want the new normal. Just give me a shot. But the silver lining is they just came out with a study, 3 times the amount of people now are anti-vax and, doing their due diligence. And so it's interesting times, it's definitely warfare. I know you're not an American, but most of us think this is a civil war, if not a world war that we're entering, whether it's a tech tyranny or whatever. But I really feel like, and this might be part of why people call me crazy, I believe vaccines are lethal warfare. When you study history and you look at the last World War, it was always about drugs. They gave their soldiers methamphetamine salts so they wouldn't sleep and they could fight the French. And then their physicists were, destroying the brains of, what they considered a subspecies, the Jewish or the Armenian, whatever war you were looking at, MK Ultra, crazy stuff, like down that rabbit hole. So I feel like sorry for people that are asleep, because it sucks being awake and like when you're cognizant, but I would rather know than not know, because atrocities happen that way, and it is the doctors. I'm always like, I'm considered a whistleblower, right? I'm like, it's the doctors. they're the ones that have been beside Mussolini and Hitler and Stalin and all these guys. It was always the psychiatrists, and they were like messing with people's brains. And
yeah, and I feel like
yeah,
though, like a lot of doctors and people in politics as well, or people who work for the government, they are puppets of people who are higher above them, you know, controlling them as well. So I feel like not all doctors know, but I have like one doctor friend and he's fully aware. He's anti-vax, and I'm pretty sure I actually know a few more who are anti-vax, but a lot of those doctors are afraid to speak up because they will actually lose their job and their career if they do. Have you
yeah.
struggled with that yourself?
I did for a while, but for me, it was, I had a moment where it was like do or die. And I had to decide on when I was finishing my second doctorate at USC, and I went to the independent review board, and I already knew there was a witch hunt going on. So for me, I really had nothing to lose. It's almost like a suicide mission.
Yeah.
And it was like they pulled every card in the book they could. So it's like playing chess. And when you realize these things, I mean, if you're interested, if your viewers are interested, I've done diagrams before. Most people don't know how the structure works, but it's actually independent review boards. It is actually the colleges, the collegiate circuits that are controlling what's happening. So there is Center for Disease Control and the National Institute of Health here,
Yeah.
but they're running it all through colleges. That's why you constantly hear like, oh, Yale and Harvard and Princeton and Stanford. And like, so when I got to USC and I was in this elite global executive program and I was flying all over the world, meeting with prime ministers and all of these, I just like stood back and kind of watched and realized when they knew what I was doing at my clinics and my schools and was like this close to publishing all the data was when all my craziness happened.
Yeah.
So
what do you
it
mean?
was a chess move.
Yeah. What do you mean they were going to post what you were doing?
So what I had comprised in my doctoral thesis was what they're called qualitative and quantitative mixed studies. So in my clinics and my schools, when a patient would come in, I would send out coordination of care to all of their medical doctors. So that was including the doctors that caused the vaccine injury, and then their treating doctors, all the circuit doctors that you're referring to, the ones that know it's a vaccine injury or are afraid, and they're quiet behind scenes, or they're the medical doctors that are on the front lines. They're called, here in the US, they're called MAPS doctors. They're a medical association of pediatrics for special needs. So I was doing that, then I was going to the government and getting all of their data and coordination of care on services that they were supposed to provide through government funding, both federal and state. I was doing their insurance, so I was going to all of their insurance providers and compiling their data for either approved or denied services. And then I was getting their school district records through what's called an individualized education plan under the American Disability Act. So I had set out this entire strategic plan early on when I was in my mid-20s, when I began opening the clinics and schools. So I collected all of it. They were all in my servers.
Yeah.
I was finishing up the lawsuits. It was a lot of money that we were settling out. And so I went to USC to publish, and then the independent review board caught on to what I was doing, because I kind of was like navigating quietly that I was just going to publish on my, I developed intellectual property that teaches the children that are nonverbal how to type.
Yeah.
But what I was doing was a qualitative and quantitative study of all these surveys of the data, the pre and post that was sitting in my files. So I was going to like exonerate Andy Wakefield and Judy and Bradstreet and Roosevelt. And it was like, bam, 5 anonymous complaints against my license, like these accusations I was meant to
So you knew about Judy a while ago, like many years ago.
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
Yeah. We all know about each other.
Oh, wow. Oh, that's so interesting.
Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, we're like a grassroots. We find each other. It's like, I always equate it. It's funny because it's, the whole Black Lives Matters now, but it's like they had their Underground Railroad, and you had Martin Luther King and you had Malcolm X, and like they had their organizations. Well, so do we. You guys think we're like crazy, but we're actually pretty smart, and trust me, you have your plan and we have ours. But I kind of got busted halfway through, and it was like so that's my long-winded like answer on For me, it was more of a suicide mission, because I was already like.
But the main purpose of all of that was to warn people about vaccinations, or to actually target the people who are responsible for handing out vaccines?
Well, my goal was kind of both. It was to show the outcomes of the children that were at our clinic and schools that were being treated for vaccine injury. And then I was cross-correlating the side effects of vaccines. So it was both to prove it was a vaccine, because if you look back to one of your questions on, do you get informed consent and do they tell you what's in a vaccine? Well, you can go and get what's in a vaccine and it shows you what it causes. It's on NIH and CDC's site, or it's in the insert that you get. So I was cross-correlating what was proven and already acknowledged that it causes to all of the medical records that I had, and then the doctors that were solution focused in treating it like a vaccine injury, instead of, what I call, I won't cuss, but you know what I mean, like the DSM and that it's autism and it's ADHD. And of course I'm a clinician, so I'm whistleblowing on my own industry. And then we were working, there was a bunch of us that were psychologists, behavior analysts, social workers. I had 312 employees. We were all licensed clinicians, and we all knew it. So then I was doing surveys on them. And so I had this whole 15-year strategic plan on being solution focused. So showing hey, you guys are a bunch of liars, essentially. We know your game. It's all smoke and mirrors that you're calling it autism and ADHD, but hey, all the medical records show encephalopathy, seizures, autoimmunity, eczema, learning disabilities,
Crazy.
All that stuff.
And can I ask, for people who are wondering, why are these people who are creating the vaccines, why is the vaccine industry wanting to harm people if they're so unhealthy anyway in the first place? Why are they doing it in the first place?
Have you ever heard the saying customer for life? If you're a profit model and you want a customer for life, then that's what they're creating for you. No better marketing strategy than to say you need something, and
if you don't get it, then something bad will happen, right?
Oh yeah, that's marketing sales 101, is you play on people's fear. Fear always buys. You're scared. Even you can go down any industry. I'm in my mid 40s almost now. I'm I'm afraid I'm gonna get old. Let me go get some Botox. It's whatever. It's a fear model, and what better way than to scare you into you're gonna die if you don't do this. And then people don't put together the whole population is getting sick. So it's a business model. It's, profiteering on both sides of the fence. I think that was the biggest wake up for me in the early 2000s, was when I realized the vaccine manufacturer was the same manufacturer the drug Dominic needed to stay alive. It was wait a second, poisoned him, and now he needs your medication. So Eli Lilly, Merck, Pfizer, they're all the manufacturer of the drug, because vaccine is a drug. It's a pharmaceutical drug.
Yeah.
And then now you've got all these medical issues and psychiatric issues, and I'm going to go nuts because you're a crazy child and I can't sleep at night. Yeah. So of course I'm going to go and get meds to help you. So I realized it was an entire business model that was very strategically and operationally designed.
Right. So they're just wanting to make money, and they don't give a shit how fucked up they make the citizens of America in the meantime.
I mean, do you know Bill Gates doesn't vaccinate his kids? That's when you look at all these guys, they don't actually vaccinate their children. Yeah. Because why? If they know, then they're not going to do it.
Yeah. That's such an important thing for people to look at too, right? Do these people who are promoting vaccines, do they vaccinate their kids? And that's crazy. They don't.
Yeah. Have you ever watched Mad Men? Mad Men it's a show on Netflix. It's kind of parallel to real life, but it's also just a TV drama. But it's all about the smoking industry. How all of these marketing guys that worked for Camel and the big companies, the cigarette manufacturing companies, are also the same ones that are responsible for vaccines and the drugs that treat mental health. So it was they were passing out cigarettes to pregnant women, and the American, the Surgeon General and the Attorney General said cigarette smoking was safe, and like they showed pictures of doctors and pregnant women doing it.
Yeah.
But they show none of them were smoking. They all knew it caused cancer, and they were just lying and trying to shove it, the research down. So I think we're seeing that play itself out again.
Yeah. And relating to COVID now, if I can quickly touch on that. So why do you think, like, because vaccines is one thing, them wanting to vaccinate your children, when they're born, and then 6 months and 1 year and 2 years, or however their routine goes. But now that they're wanting to enforce this vaccine on pretty much everyone in the world, do you have any ideas of, is it also just money of why they're doing this? Like placing a fear, like, oh, there's this deadly virus, anyone can die from it, and this is the solution, they're going to make money from it? Or do you think there's something more than just money behind this vaccine that's happening?
That's a great question. I mean, I think that there's that. Obviously, you look at the profiteering in the model.
Yeah.
I mean, politics, people in the US, we love our politics, right? We like to debate all the time, and we get all worked up, and because we feel like the sense of power, and it's actually really pseudo power.
Or that we're part of a team, right? That you're part of a team. You're like, yeah, I'm left and you're right. And everyone on the left makes fun of the people on the right, and everyone on the right makes fun of the people on the left.
Yeah. Yeah. And you have to have some kind of faith, like, oh, this politician's going to represent me and do what I want. And I hope, I'm kind of that way with Trump. I've been vocal about, libertarian values and freedom and medical freedom, and, not treading on me and those kinds of things. But I don't know what he would do when it comes to medical freedom, and leaving it up to the, now you get into constitutional stuff and just the way that America works with, you have individual states, right, in the federal government. But for COVID, I really think COVID was like a attack against what our president was trying to do, whether it was Trump or it was somebody else. I don't think it has to do with who the president was. I just think it was the infrastructure crumbling at its core, between people realizing that all these big corporations and industry and defying capitalism, the values that we say here we hold, the media, the social injustice, there's, the big theme now is like Black Lives Matters, but what about women's life, and what about LGBTQ? And like, we just love to perpetuate as Americans that we're like this free land, and it's smoke and mirror bullshit. And so I don't know. I think that COVID was very multifaceted between, world wars, tech tyranny and product, between China and how manufacturing and infrastructure, and then you have the Middle East issues between control over resources, and they always sell it in the sake of humanity, but come on, it's like always about resources. It's always about oil, and it's always about, manufacturing products, and manufacturing products includes vaccines, like you have to think about the business model when it comes to COVID, or even just the mask issue now with here in California. Governor Newsom just signed a contract with China for $1 billion for masks, and now coincidentally it's mandated that we have to wear masks, when it's very parallel, the issue of COVID, with what parents like me and professionals have been dealing with across the board with the plethora of vaccines. And so you're seeing those parallels play out in terms of, the vaccine on COVID, the syringes and how it's cultivated. A lot of those are done in Wuhan. They're done in China. And then commerce, trade coming in, and the taxation. I learned a while back that Puerto Rico, actually the reason Puerto Rico here in the US became US territory is because they offshored the manufacturing of pharmaceutical products. So I went over to Puerto Rico, I think like 2 years ago, and I worked with a lot of the crypto guys that do a lot of volunteer work after the hurricane. And we drove around. I was like, oh my God, there's Eli Lilly and there's Merck. And then I found out that they wrote legislation. They don't have to pay taxes there. So you can do all of this, offshoring pharmaceutical production. And then it just comes across into Miami through their ports, and then through Long Beach and LA. And so I think there's a lot more at play when it comes to COVID, right? Tanking the economy, getting rid of the middle class. So I think it goes way beyond what they're telling us about just this simple virus that we now know, like, hey, it's similar to the flu. And then you've got was it, really funded by Obama? Did he really, with Dr. Fauci, send all that money over there? I mean, it's a rabbit hole to fall down.
I know. There's so much information out there. It's hard to tell right now what's true and what's not. It's crazy. Do you know roughly how much money the vaccine industry makes in a year? Just for people to get an idea.
I don't know exactly. I could look that up. That's a great question.
Yeah.
I know it's hundreds of billions.
Yeah.
If you factor in, so I was at a meeting in Washington, D.C. in November, and I was working with the Republican Party, and Dr. Shiva was there, and he asked me to get him some numbers on what the actual entirety of the business model payout was, and it was $2 trillion. The profiteering model from start to finish. I did with my SPSS software. It's like a research software that I have. And I went through from literally like, all I do is take my son, right? And I take his life and I run through everything that happens in terms of who profited, who made money, all the way down to the doctor's visit, because the doctors make money off of, how many vaccines they give, plus the doctor's visit, plus they bill insurance. So now you got to factor in the insurance who needs money, and then they get federal funding and grant. Okay, now he's sick. So once they're sick, now you've got to go to all these different government sites, and where does that money come from? And as they get older, so I literally did a longitudinal study from start to finish on vaccines and if you're vaccine injured and what that cost is to take care of you on all spectrums of the industry. And it was shocking. It was $2 trillion.
Wow. That's incredible.
Yeah, it was pretty bad once we sat back and looked at the data.
Yeah.
So but in general, overall, like, I don't know what the profit is for, I did actually have them subcategoried out in terms of like Eli Lilly and Merck and Pfizer, the big manufacturers of it. And then of course, tax dollars. People, I think that's the one thing I always try to adhere to people when they're wanting to learn. It's like, don't you care where your tax dollars are going? Like, why? Have you ever thought why we're so heavily taxed? It used to be the Boston Tea Party issues on like how much, you're taxing the tea. Now, do you ever like wonder where your money is going and how it's getting spent? And so people don't realize how much tax dollars go into the vaccine funds and from start to finish. Even the education system, I know in California, we ran numbers when I was working with some senators here on the education system. There's close to 1 million kids that receive special education services. And if each child, they get something called an XPOT. They don't, people just don't know this. I'm a nurse, so I like to find out.
Yeah.
And they get federal tax dollars, they get state tax dollars, and it's like multiple billions of dollars that taxpayer money is going to care for this little, rat race that they've got going on based off of sick children. So the numbers in California alone are astronomical.
Wow, that's crazy. You're such a smart cookie. You're such a smart girl. I love it. Can I ask you, for people, especially like parents with kids right now who are on the fence about this COVID vaccine, and if they make it mandatory, like, oh, if you want your life to go back to normal, if you want your kids to still go to school, if they push that vaccine and parents are on the fence and they're getting pressured from other parents, like, if you don't vaccinate your kids, you're putting my kids at risk. Like, what would you say to those parents who are not really sure about what to do right now?
So I think it's impossible to answer that question without looking at the totality of vaccines.
Right.
I think this is that wake-up call. Like, what have I already injected into my child? Have I really saved humanity or my neighbor or the kids that they're running around school with, which is bizarre, right? Because they're all sick with their colds and their ear infections and their fevers and their seizures and their ADHD and their autism. Is like, really? Who are you saving from what health? So what? They didn't break out in measles. Yeah. So I think you have to get really honest and do your own due diligence now, because you can't really answer the question of COVID, which is going to be fast-tracked, which is going to be even worse because it's not going to go through the standard testing procedures not only is it not going to be, there's not going to be any double placebo blind studies on it. There's not going to be any animal trials. They just jump straight to human trials. And so that it's unethical to test any pharmaceutical product, including vaccines, on children. So the Institute of Medicine in 2013 came out with their own research that showed they've never tested vaccines, let alone in single dosage, combined dosages, time, frequency, breaking down. You have something called an independent variable, dependent variable based off of each way that they're cultivated. So if you're going from the virus, the live virus itself, or you're going from the bacteria or the antibiotics they put in those things, or now we're going back to the toxins, all the different combination of toxins in it. So the Institute of Medicine was really brave, and they came out and said, like, these have never been studied, and it's impossible to study them because you can't study children. You can't experiment on children.
Yeah.
So that's for parents. They have to just figure it out, like, and it sucks because it's cognitive dissonance, right? You have to face your own demon or face your own ignorance and face your own, like, oh my God, what have I done? But most people that aren't like in the category where we are, where you have severe autism or severe seizures or death, you're lucky, that there is an argument that I will concede with families on that is, 1%, it's now 2% of the population is struggling with moderate to severe autism, or what they're calling autism, right? Where they can't talk. So was my son worth the risk of everybody else? But the answer I always come up with is no, because now you have to add up all the other things and factor in mental health and divorce rate and financial deprivation for the minor things, the discomfort of the side effects from vaccines. So I think parents just trying to decide if they're going to, vaccinate against COVID, they have to look now and face that reality and get rid of their cognitive dissonance and be brave enough to realize they just didn't know. And now so go ahead and take your chance. Good luck with that.
Yeah. And not to feel the pressure, the peer pressure from their parents or their friends, their children's friends, parents, or whatever, like, oh, you need to get your kids vaxxed, unless I don't want my kids playing with your kids, or whatever the case may be. Like,
a lot of families just don't talk about it. I'm friends, with a lot of medical doctors and lawyers, and they just keep it to themselves, and some of them just lie. They just they rather not have the debate, the scrutiny, the conflict, and they they keep their circles small, and they surround themselves with people that are like-minded. I'm still an optimist after all of this. I do think that we're going to see in the next few years the truth come out. I just think it's a matter of time.
Yeah. Me too.
I don't know how they can keep hiding it.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you so much for your time. You're amazing. How can people find you online?
Instagram, just Professor Jamie Lynn. And then I'm on Facebook, Jamie Lynn Juarez. And then our website, for if anybody is, in need and struggling, that has a child that is injured, our nonprofit is HopeIncAcademy.org or hopeforautism.com, and all of our stuff is free. I've used the resources that I have, and we have a private group on Facebook. You can go in there and download, pretty much everything that we talked about on how to get insurance coverage, how to treat their children, what doctors to find, everything. We just really love to be able to donate and help other families.
Awesome. I will put all of those links in the show notes as well for people to find.
Oh, you're so sweet. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much.
Yes, thank you. Namaste.